Thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor to be a part of the Geneva Summit this year. And you mentioned a few minutes ago, you mentioned Eleanor Roosevelt and her work on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. A few years before she did that, and a few years before she became the first chair of the UN Human Rights Commission, she helped co-found an American NGO called Freedom House, which still, until this day, several decades later, is still very much kind of the gold standard for judging and assessing the situation with human rights and political freedoms around the globe. And a few weeks ago, they launched their 45th annual report assessing the situation with rights and freedoms. They've been doing it since the early 70s, but they have only began including Russia in the report since 1991. They did not assess the Soviet Union before then, so unfortunately we cannot compare directly their analysis for the Soviet Union, let's say under Brezhnev or Andropov back in the late 70s, early 80s, and the situation in Russia today. But I would venture to say that if we could compare those indicators directly, they would have been remarkably similar. We hear very often that Russia today is not the Soviet Union, and indeed it is not, for very many reasons. But if we look at the situation with domestic political repression, it is actually becoming quite similar. Just as then, all major television stations in Russia today serve as tools for government propaganda. Just as then, opponents of the government are denounced as traitors and foreign agents. Just as then, elections serve as a meaningless ritual with no real pluralism and no real competition, except it's more sophisticated nowadays. Grigory Yavlinsky recently referred to the system we have in Russia today as a postmodern dictatorship. Back in the Soviet days, when you came, to vote, quote unquote, in an election, you literally had one name written on your ballot. Now you have several names, but of course in reality there's still only one. So they've managed to do it a little more creatively, but the essence is the same. And just as in late Soviet times, we have many people who are in prison for no other reason than having crossed the path of the regime. And even the figures are becoming very similar. In 1975, when Andrei Sakharov wrote his Nobel lecture, he listed 126 prisoners of conscience in the Soviet Union. Today, according to Memorial, we have 117 political prisoners in Russia, and this is a conservative estimate using very rigorous standards. They're a very diverse crowd. They include people like Oleg Navalny, the brother of anti-corruption campaigner and banned presidential candidate Alexei Navalny, Oleg Sentsov, the Crimean film director who protested against the annexation, Alexei Pichugin, who after almost 15 years is Russia's longest serving political prisoner. And prison terms such as this take us now not even to Brezhnev's but back to Stalin's time. And in some ways the situation today is worse than it was under Brezhnev or Andropov. Back then, back in the 70s, 80s, major political dissidents were in prison, in forced exile, or internal confinement. Today, the most prominent political dissident in Russia is dead. Next week marks the 3rd anniversary of the day when Boris Nemtsov, former deputy prime minister, the most prominent, the strongest, the most effective leader of the democratic opposition in Russia, was assassinated as he walked across a bridge in front of the Kremlin. And 3 years on, there's continuing cover-up and continuing impunity for the organizers and masterminds of his assassination. But as Vladimir Bukovsky once noted, himself, of course, a legendary Soviet-era dissident, it's a remarkable feature of Russian history that even in the absolutely darkest periods of repression and intimidation and propaganda, you always find people in Russia who are prepared to stand up to the injustice and the tyranny. And so it is the case today. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak here, because when Russia is discussed in such large international formats, when people talk about Russia, they usually talk about the Kremlin regime. And very often they equate the two. In effect, accepting the Kremlin's own narrative that, quote, there is no Russia without Putin. This is a direct statement from Vyacheslav Volodin, one of Mr. Putin's closest political aides. I can find few things that are more insulting to say about my country. And I think it is important to pay attention to the fact that despite the repression and intimidation and the propaganda, despite the risks and the potential consequences, there are more and more people in Russia today who are prepared to stand up to the injustice, to the abuses, and to the corruption of the Putin regime. In the last few months, thousands of people, tens of thousands of people went to the streets all across our country, in more than 200 towns and cities, large and small, across 11 time zones, literally from Kaliningrad to Khabarovsk, to voice their protest at the pervasive government corruption, at the lack of accountability, at the sham elections, and at the very fact that the same person has now held power in our country without regard for such niceties as term limits or free elections for almost 2 decades. And the vast majority of those people who came out to protest were young people, university and high school students, those in their late teens and early 20s, the very generation that was raised and in many cases born under Vladimir Putin, who have no other political memory. And yet it is they who are increasingly saying enough. They are the future of Russia, literally. They are the Russia of tomorrow. And the fact that so many of them, again, that so many of the people who have never seen anything except Vladimir Putin are prepared to go out publicly and stand up against this regime, I think this is in many ways a turning point for Russia. And I think it is a very worrying sign for the Kremlin. I'd certainly be worried if I were them right now. But I think it is a very hopeful sign for the democratic future of our country.